Code switching as a pedagogical tool, that is, using responsible code switching for teaching a subject or teaching another language. So code switching, we are saying, is a good resource for the teachers because it enables them to provide a kind of scaffolding or some kind of support to the learners as they move towards learning another language or learning a new content in a new language. So there are a few examples or few instances when code switching might be very helpful. For instance, if you are defining a word, it is good to use a code switching. That does not mean that when the child writes words meanings, for instance, in their books, they are writing an English word and they're writing the other answer to it in another language. It might well be there. But then the learners also need to know how to define the same word in the same language also. But when we talk about defining a word, for instance, if you want to tell, for instance, what a fritter is, so it is easier to tell that it is something like a pakoda rather than going about giving long descriptions of what the thing looks like and using a vocabulary which is even more sort of like complicated just because you want to explain the thing in the same language. Then it is argued that you might provide a linguistic summary of how one language, how the subject discussed in a language is slightly different in the way the other language expresses it. For instance, let me remind you that the writing style in Urdu is very different from the writing style in English language. So when you're teaching Urdu language, essay writing, and we can talk about how essay writing in English language is done, and the students will clearly understand then when they are writing an academic paper in these two different languages, then they are following two different styles so that they understand when they make their linguistic or stylistic choices from their own linguistic repertoire. It is argued that code switching might be helpful when the teacher has taught a lesson in the second language, for instance, and then she summarizes the lesson in the other language. So either one can be used to teach and either one can be used to summarize a lesson. And we will come to this method a little later in the coming modules. Then we can also talk about the structure of the language use. For instance, English language, the use of have been, it has been raining. So if you translate that in Urdu, when talking about tenses, for instance, it becomes much easier for the students to say or to choose a linguistic structure from the second language when they know what exactly it means, and they know what exactly it means by referral to their own language. So what we are saying is that for code switching to act as a pedagogical tool, we are making use of languages hybridly, and it is much more complicated than simple code switching that we do in everyday life. So this code switching is definitely systematic. You know exactly your learners. So I'm not saying that no spontaneous use of code switching will occur, but when it occurs, the teachers need to be careful about where it has occurred to anticipate future needs and to what extent or how much it is being used to be able to control that so that the goals of the lesson are achieved. So it is systematic, it is strategic, as we talked about at what point something should be which language should be used, and it is affiliative, that is, it allows you to make connections across languages so that it is easier for the learners to develop that cross-linguistic understanding. And this is essentially a sense-making process. So we need to use it as a resource. We need to focus on expanding written and oral expression using code switching. Very helpful there, and we'll talk about how it happens. And it is also very helpful in establishing relationships of trust.